So I'm going to show you slip painting. Slip painting has to happen when the clay is still leather hard. You can't paint slip on a dry piece. It'll break the piece actually. You can't put water back into a completely dry piece or it cracks it. And so you got to have something like right after you trim. And so we just trimmed this bowl today. And the slips that we have in the studio are mixed up in these buckets, and they're labeled for different colors. There's a color chart on the wall, and this one is a blue-green slip. Now you have to pay attention to what it says on the bucket because the colors in the bucket aren't going to give you that idea of what it's going to be. It's going to be a nice blue, but a greenish blue. Okay. Now what you do is you stir it up, and it should be kind of a thickish. It shouldn't be super thin and runny. It should go on with a little bit of texture. So it's kind of like, it's not really yogurty, but it's not thin like you would have with a glaze. And you want to use a brush that's like an animal hair brush, a real soft brush. And we have these nice thick animal hair brushes that we use for slip painting. I set this bowl on a turntable just because it makes it easier for me to sort of paint the slip on. You don't dip a piece into the slip because the piece isn't fired yet. It could crumble and melt. You could easily break it and it could fall into the slip. So you want to paint it on. You always use brushes to put slip on. A lot of times I'll let the slip set up a little bit so it's not super wet, and you can touch it without it coming off on your finger and do a second coat just to make sure it's nice and coated, evenly coated. Now the cool thing about slip painting is that once you have this color on, and you can paint with slip decoratively too, like you don't have to just do one solid color on your piece. Slip is not a glaze, and so it's just a color on the surface of your piece. It would actually need a clear glaze on top to really look glazed, to look shiny. It's a super dry finish otherwise. But with slip painting, there's a couple of fun things you can do. You can carve through it, get back to the clay, and you can carve, different patterns, whatever you want to carve on it. And you already have a couple of colors happening on the surface. In fact, with slip decoration, you can use a variety of slip colors on top of each other to get interesting things to happen without ever having started even with the glaze. Glaze happens after the bisque. So this is something you could do before you're even getting to the kiln. This is something you can't do later. The slip won't stick well to fired clay. It'll crack a piece that's completely dry. So this is something you have to do at the leather hard stage in order to use a slip and to get a sort of a base color. Some people would like to paint their pieces white with white slip if it's a stoneware piece, because sometimes glazes can look really pretty on white, and it's why some people will throw with porcelain, because they want that white underneath their glaze. It kind of brightens the glaze, makes it prettier and more interesting in some ways. So there's lots of reasons to change the colors, the surface color of your clay. It's not something you have to do in the clay itself. It's much more difficult to do a colored clay because it takes an enormous amount of colorant to make your clay colored, to make the color show up in your clay. But you can do all sorts of changes on the surface of your piece. You can see I painted the whole foot with the slip as well, and that way, get this extra out of there. That way it kind of looks like the whole piece is made out of blue-green clay. Now we got these two colors already happening. In fact, at this point, if you've done a lot of slip decorating and carving, then you could probably just do a clear glaze over that and already be done with your decorating. I would like to see people do things with decorating to move away from just a very simple sort of boring pot. We're in an art studio here, so I do want people to to push themselves creatively, to try some different things with ornamentation and decoration. So slip is one way to do that. Underglaze is something that you buy commercially, and you can get black and white in these big jugs. Sometimes you can get other colors that way. Most of the time, they come in this size, the pint size at the store, or smaller. So underglaze is basically pigment and binder, and so it behaves in a very sort of controllable way. It's not going to run around and blend and melt on your piece, and so you can actually do things, effects with it, that will stay the way they look when you do it. So we're going to do an effect with bubbles today, and one of the things to keep in mind when you're choosing your colors that you want to use for your underglaze bubbles, don't use colors that are that are already difficult to keep in the high temperature. We fired a cone 6 with this stuff, and so we lose the red, we lose the orange, we lose the yellow, because when you apply those colors, they have to go on thick in order to show up. And you can't do that with this effect. With the bubble effect, it has to go on as it goes on, nice and thin. And so what you want to do is choose a color that's going to work. And I know that black works great. We have an example here of a plate that I did with the black that has a really nice bubble effect. Showed up really well on the white clay. You can also, if you're not using white clay, you can paint your piece with some white underglaze before you start, and that way you'll have a white underneath instead of pink or orange or whatever's going to happen with your clay body. If it's not going to stay white, you might want to paint it white. You can also paint it with slip before you get a bisque fired, because white slip you can use for that, but white shows up really nice underneath with this technique. So the way you make your material is you get any measuring device, anything. It doesn't have to be even a measuring device, just something that holds liquid, and you stay consistent with it in parts. So you have 3 parts water, okay? Then you're going to have 2 parts underglaze, and I'm just going to shake this up a little bit, make sure it's mixed. I like the way the black looks. Blue and green also work really well. Okay, so that's 3 parts water, 2 parts underglaze, and 1 part soap. Then your soap is just dishwashing soap. Don't get anything special or different, because it might not work as well. And then fill your measuring device 1 time with your soap. Okay, so that's your mixture, and I found that if you deviate from that, it can go on too thin and you don't get enough color, or if you try to intensify it, which I tried that, it doesn't work because you end up getting just big blobs of underglaze instead of bubbles. So this is the mixture, and you stir it up, get it mixed up, and you want to just sort of stay with this mixture. And you want to use a container where it's not too far from the top of the container so it can bubble out. You don't want a really tall container that takes forever to get the bubbles to come out. So Monique is going to help me with this part of it, because it was easy to do on the plate because the bubbles just spilled out kind of onto the flat surface. But what you want is to, if you have a piece like this, you want to kind of lay it this way and then turn it, because the bubbles, otherwise, as they fall down the side, they're not going to look as pretty. So we've learned a few things. Another thing I want to comment on is we haven't put any glaze on the inside of this yet. I always tell you to do the inside first, but in this case, we're going to have to put this back in the kiln and bisque it again after we do this, because we found that the soap resists the clear glaze. So we need to burn the soap off, and we just put it back into the bisque firing and get the soap off of it before we do glaze. So that's why there's no glaze on the inside of this pot already. Okay. Just turn it. So you may take a little time to make sure all the parts of your piece get as much bubble as you want. You can also rinse it up if you don't like it. Try again. We have disposable straws. We also have reusable straws. Obviously, reusable straws are smarter, better for the seals or whoever's eating them, getting sick from them. So if you want to buy your own straw, that's cool. Oops. Okay, so you get the idea. Alright, so what we're going to do now is it's a marbling effect for glazing that you can do with shaving cream. And you may have done this on paper before. This is a common way of doing marbling on paper, is use shaving cream. So you have to make sure you have the foamy stuff, the stuff that foams up. And here, this is the one we're using. It's a foaming. If it's a gel, you have to foam it up yourself, and it's more trouble. So if you can find an old-fashioned foaming shaving gel, shaving cream, make sure it's cream and not gel, and then create a pad with it. And this is going to have the same problem that you have with the bubbles technique with the soap, is that you're going to need to put it through the bisque again and get rid of all the soap from the surface before you try to put a glaze on it, because otherwise the glaze won't stick well to the surface. You'll have the glaze sort of crawling all around and it won't look nice. One of the things that's nice about doing that, though, is if you've put it back in the bisque, is that you've fired the underglaze on, and that way you can even rinse the pot and you won't wash the underglaze off. So that's actually kind of a bonus to that drawback, is that once you do bisque it again, then you have more flexibility with glazing later. You can wipe it off and you won't wipe off the underglaze. Alright, so you make a pad of the shaving cream. Obviously you need the foaming kind that makes a big pad. Let me rinse my hands off real quick. Alright, now we tried a couple different ways of putting the color into the shaving cream, and we tried some little squirt bottles, and we found that the little squirt bottles didn't really put enough material down, especially if you're going to do a pot like this that you're going to roll through with a large surface. You're not going to get enough of an interesting effect. The colors are going to be too close together, and it's not going to show up as nicely as if you kind of dribble it on. Okay, so we've chosen 3 different colors. This one's marine blue, red brown, and leaf green. You can choose any colors you want. I recommend at least 3 to get a nice marbling. Okay, and I'm just going to kind of dribble some across, like that. And then I'm going to take another one, make sure it's mixed. Dribble it across. And the green. darker green. That's all right. Okay, and then you're gonna take a stick. I usually take the other end of a paintbrush, and you're just gonna force it to marble already. Like this. So you kind of like it, you know, it starts to look marbly. Okay, and then think about which way you want it to go across your pot. Do I want it to go this way? Do I want it to go this way? I think I want it to go this way. So I'm going to take my pot. I'm just going to roll it across in the marbling material like that. Okay, so obviously it's really hard to see what you got. So what you have to do then is rinse it off. And you don't want to rinse it off aggressively. You just want to go over to the sink and rinse off the soap and then stop. And in this case, like I said, you're going to want to this fire it again. Let me get the top of that a little bit on there. Doesn't want to go on. All right, so I'm going to rinse it. Now, if there's a spot that you feel like you want to touch up again, you certainly can. You still have your pad of shaving cream over there, and I think I might want to do that right here. Kind of didn't really stick on that part, but some of this other stuff looks really good. And then once you've got it, the soap mostly rinsed off, you're going to want to put this back in the bisque kiln. And like the other one, when we were doing the bubbles, I told you, don't put the glaze on the inside yet. Don't put any glaze on it yet. Just get this fired on and then deal with glaze later. And don't try to put glaze on top of this without putting it back in the kiln and getting all the soap off, because then it's not going to stick well. So there you have it. That's the marbling technique.